my name is David Peat, and I started off as a theoretical physicist. I was born in Liverpool and went to university there, then came out to Canada, to Ottawa and Kingston, and did research there. But I also had interest in other things. You know, I was always in art, and began to strike up some friendships with artists and people like that. And then the other thing was writing books. I sort of, in the end, I quit the research job and started to write books. And one day I got a phone call from Leroy Littlebird, and you know, at the time I thought he was inviting me to a circle in a teepee. I was on the reservation near Calgary, and I thought it must be a mistake. He couldn't, you know, he's obviously got the wrong person, but it was me, and I went, and then began to meet Leroy on more occasions, and other people, and went out to the Sundance on the reservation. Also went down to Akwesasne, which is the Iroquois reservation in Canada, and met with one of the elders there. So that was one sort of set of relationships that set up. And then in '94 we moved from Canada, and in the end settled in a little village in Italy. So that's where I've been ever since, a little medieval village south of Sierra, where we've got a centre. So when I was in London, I made friends with a number of artists. One was Anish Kapoor, another was Anthony Gormley, but several other artists, and artists in the States, in New York, also Marina Abramovich, who was at that time in Holland. And when Anish had a big show at the Hayward Gallery in London, he asked me would I give a gallery tour. They didn't give talks, but a person would go to the gallery with an audience and discuss the pieces. He said, I want you to do that as a scientist, say what you're seeing. So I did that, and at the end of that, somebody from the Arts Council said, if we gave you some money, what would you do? And I said, I'd get a group of artists and scientists together in a really nice place with good food for a weekend, and no agenda, and we'd just talk, and that's what we did. And some nice pieces came out of that. A performance piece by Ansaman Bezwas that he did at Headlands in San Francisco, and a big piece by Anthony Gormley called Quantum Cloud. And that just came out of a discussion between myself, Basil Hardy, who was Bohm's assistant, and Anthony about space and what would be pre-space. And we said you use algebras, and he said, what's an algebra? And he said it's a set of relationships of relationships. And so he built this piece, which is meter rods all welded together, which looks random, but from a certain angle turns out to be a human being. So it was neat that for a little bit of money we got people together, and it sparked up ideas. So I think it's great when scientists, artists, or Native Americans and scientists or artists get together and just talk. David Bohm would be a person I've been long being associated with, and he was very interested in language. He was a physicist, but he was interested in, you know, how do you know about the quantum world? And when you talk about the quantum world, you're using everyday language, English or German or French, and all those languages contain assumptions about space and time and causality. So it was the famous physicist Niels Bohr says we're suspended in language. We don't know what is up and what is down. And Bohm wanted to take that further, and he saw that the world we live in, the world of classical physics, is objects well defined in space that interact with each other via forces and fields. And these languages that we speak, which are all basically Indo-European languages, also use nouns and verbs. So you say the cat chases the mouse. So you have a well-defined object, another well-defined object, and some action between them. And so he kept dreaming about a different type of language. And eventually, each year we'd meet at a place near Ossining, New York. Dave would spend a month there. And Leroy Littlebird turned up. And they had a discussion, and Bohm began to realize that this other type of language did exist. And it was tied to the Blackfoot worldview, which is everything is flux and change and process. Nothing is really constant. And so I was visiting the FETSA Institute in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I said to them, you know, it'd be great to have just some Native American elders and some Western scientists just sit in a circle and talk. And so that was it. That happened in 1992, and David Bohm was there, and Leroy Littlebird was there, and that's how that dialogue took place. And that for David Bohm was very important. You know, I think he was very moved by that, and to see, because the other speakers were Mi'kmaq and Ojibwe and Cree, and they all spoke that same big language family, the Algonquin language family, which is very strongly verb-based. And it's also a language in which it's difficult to form categories. And we see that in a lot of the problems we have in our world are because we categorize things. But if you can't make categories, then you treat each thing, you know, individually, and that it may not be permanent, it may change. So that happened in 1992, and then after that I moved to Italy, and I sort of lost contact with that world. So really it's only revived by coming here to see to come to this dialogue, which has been going on for several years, but this is the first one I've attended. I was invited last year, but I couldn't come because my daughter was having a baby. So it's great to be back and, you know, make that contact with Leroy again and everybody else, and get involved in that discussion, that dialogue, which in part was I think inspired partly by a Native American talking circle and partly by what Leroy had discussed with David Bohm about David Bohm's views on dialogue, because David Bohm had been doing the dialogue groups in England for some years. So it's sort of a combination of the two. I had many meetings with Leroy, partly because Leroy was coming to Ottawa because the Canadian Constitution was being created, and Pierre Trudeau, the Prime Minister, had invited Native leaders to attend, so Leroy was partly there for that. And also going out to the reservation and going to Akwesasne and seeing the Iroquois, which is a completely different type of world. I mean, the Iroquois are farmers and the Blackfoot follow the buffalo, you know, they're different people. But I would say, if people said, were you learning about Native American ways, I'd say no. What they had done is provided a mirror in which I began to see my own culture. So it was a mirror for my culture, and then I began to see things that I'd taken for granted that were inevitably true were just cultural assumptions. So that was very interesting it's as if you're looking at it in a very fresh way and saying, wait a minute, you know, that thing that's, you know, is inevitable, it must be, in fact is an assumption that we made about the world, and the world may not be like that at all. So I think that was the great thing I got out of it, was to see my own culture in a mirror provided by the Native Americans. I mean, maybe I learned some facts or stories from Native Americans about their world, but it was more, the impact was more to see my world was a construct. And that's a very interesting thing to happen. That's a great gift. Well, another thing is there are many people there are two things. One is which is a diversion, is the idea of containment. The fact that people in certain religious traditions, and I've been very lucky that the Sufi community invited me to go to a lot of their meetings, and you know, so I learned a little bit about their world, and for them it was important, you know, that you had a sheikh, you had someone to guide you, and he may not have been physically there, he could appear, you know, in a dream and teach you in a dream, and you know, Ibn Arabi, you know, the famous, the two roads in Sufism is the road of knowledge of Arabi and the road of love, which is Rumi. And Ibn Arabi said that he had two great teachers, one was Muhammad and the other was Jesus, and he said Jesus was very kind to me. So they were his teachers, but in fact they weren't, in our sense, physically present. But the idea of having symbols of containment or something like that is important. But then you see people who go on spiritual journeys without those symbols of containment, and I think there's a danger there. And the thing is, they're looking to the light, and they're climbing up and climbing higher and higher, and they forget about the earth under their feet. And I think from being a child, I was always getting dirt in my fingernails, and I like the earth. So if I talk about the shadow, I'm also talking about having the feet on the ground and not flying away. So I think that's part of it. It's a bit easy. It's a bit easy to fly away, and also to be a lot. Okay, you can be. People can say, you know, I'm speaking from the heart, but often really that heart is in their head. You know, I'm speaking from my heart, but it's a lot of thoughts. It's a lot of thoughts. So again, the shadow reminds us that there are two sides to everything. The shadow isn't necessarily a bad thing. No, it's the other side. So to make things whole. There was a great deal of talk about nature, and the shadow side of nature is you know, the fact I live near Siena, which is the most beautifully preserved medieval city in Europe. Why? Well, because the plague hit Siena and wiped out between 60 and 80% of the population. So that is something that is one side of nature. You know, there are many. You know, in Europe, people, well, they're all dead now. But when I was a boy, people would remember the Great War, the 1914-18 war, and the fact of the terrible cost. We lost our sons in the war. But in fact, more people died of influenza that followed 1918 and actually died in the war. So to remember that nature, we feel close to nature, but also that nature has done those things. And that's the thing to remember. And maybe another thing was, which would have been maybe too painful to raise, was the fact that the first, everybody, you see, keeps going on about, you know, the first contact, Christopher Columbus. But the first contact wasn't Christopher Columbus, it was people that were fishing on the cod banks around Newfoundland. They were the first contact, they were the first Europeans to come to North America, and also the Vikings. And they had animals on the ships, and the animals got off, and the animals spread diseases to which the native people of this continent were not immune. So there was an incredible wiping out, I mean, incredible number. I don't know, it's 80 or 90% of the population was wiped out. And it certainly wasn't wiped out by Christopher Columbus with a few rifles, it was wiped out by disease. But when we started this centre in Italy, what we had was, I was in the village for a few years, and I'd done this conference with the artists and scientists. I was offered some money to run a conference to ask what is the state of the universities. And we were going to do it in London or New York, and then I thought, wow, there's this big building at the top of the village, why don't we do it there? So that's what we did. And we've run now, you know, every year maybe one or two, you could call them conferences if you want. If a conference is a place where someone comes to talk. But what we try to do is not have a place where people are each one gives a lecture with a PowerPoint presentation. What we like to do is to say, okay, this issue we want to look at this morning is ethics in the world of business, or how can we have ethical choices on the internet when it's not, you know, when the internet is just open to everybody. How can we do it? So that's it. We throw out a topic and people talk around the table, and so that's what we tended to do, rather than have a series of fixed talks. And the thing about fixed talks is somebody's written this where, you know, they've been in Washington or Bombay or somewhere, and they wrote the talk, and they don't. That's the thing when people say, "What are you going to talk about?" When they invite me somewhere, we'll say, "I don't know." You know, I have to give them a talk, obviously, to be practical. But until you get in the room with the audience, like the one I gave, I worked on what I was going to say here, and then when I got in the room with the audience, it turned out quite differently. But you know, if you've got your PowerPoint, it doesn't matter who's there, that's it, you're stuck with it. So I like the idea of encouraging people just to be spontaneous and responsive, and to have more of a think tank. So that's the way we've run it in PARI. It's not the same as Bohmian dialogue in any way, but it's a way of a group of people to explore together. It's hard to remember now because it happened such a long time ago, but you know, ideas about, well, particularly space and time, ideas about space and time, yes, that they really are constructs that we've lived with, and we sort of gripped us, and you know, maybe things aren't quite like that at all. And the idea about, well, you know, people call them energies or whatever, or you know, the idea of all my relations, that you have this relationship, you know, to you're two-legged and the four-legged, but also to things like rocks and trees, and you know, interesting, you know, that they would the coincidence that you know, native people would say rocks are alive, and we'd say, well, all rocks are alive. No, that rock's alive over there. And at the same time, I'm learning sculpture at art school in Ottawa, and the guy who's teaching it says, oh no, that stone's dead, don't work with that stone. He knew it too. That stone's dead. that stone's alive, work with that stone. David Bohm had died, and his widow asked me would I write his biography, and I said no, because I thought that is, you know, in Freudian terms, it's killing the father, you know. And then I heard somebody else was going to do it, and I wasn't very happy, so I said, okay, I'll do it. And so the idea was we were going to go to London to do research and just rent our house in Ottawa, and we put it with an agency, and somebody made a very good offer to buy it. And so it meant we had to leave, and we had 3 months before the place we had in London was available. And my wife said, I've always wanted to go to Siena because of the Sienese art. And so we arranged to have an apartment in Siena, and the day we left, it fell through. So we didn't have any, we had to stay in a room in somebody's house. And we looked everywhere, and, you know, at the last, you know, when the last chips were down, we were going to go to Portugal instead. And then I spotted a place, and the secretary there said, they said they had nothing. The secretary said, I know someone in a little village has a house for sale. Maybe they'll rent it to you. So that's how we went to Paris for 3 months. A year and a half later, we were traveling to a conference, and we're into the car, and on the way I said, for the night, let's stay in Paris again. We were in the hotel, and somebody shouted up to the window and said, do you want to take a house? And I said, no, we can't. My wife said, yeah, we'll take it. So, so we took it, and we realized London was too expensive, and we settled in the village. And that would be 96, so we've been there quite a long time. Now, the other story you could tell, but this isn't how it logically happened, but I wonder about it, is that when I've been meeting with the native people, they often said, the white man's got a rigid mind. And they say that the white man says, oh, you know, you native people live in an extended reality with spirits and all the rest of it. And they said, no, we don't. We just live in reality. You guys live in this restricted reality. And I wanted to know, was it, you know, I suppose part of me wanted to know, was that really true? What did it used to be like? And so the village that I moved to, I mean, they didn't have running water till the 1950s. The first car was in the 1950s. Up to that point, they would have to walk, spend a day to go to Siena, spend the night and come back. And they would just live by farming and as builders, you know, master builders. So it was interesting to go to a place where people planted by the seasons. They used the moon to tell you when to plant certain things. The moon near Easter was the important one, and by the heat of the day is, you know, in the summer by 10 o'clock it's too hot to work in the field, so you come back, you go out at 4 and you work till sunset. And so it was interesting to be in a place with different rhythms, and to sort of see that world, and to realize, yeah, maybe the modern city dweller was quite different from people in that village. You know, the neat thing in the village is, you know, some people now have television, but what some people do is they put their chair out in the road and leave the door open to watch television. So they're still part of the village. As people walk around, they can put their hand on the shoulder and say hello to them. So they're not sort of stuck in their house. Okay, the first thing is you don't really have any privacy. You know, I remember when we first go, we get on the bus and go to Siena and to buy something, and somebody say, oh, were you able to get the shirt? And I think, how on earth did they know we were going to buy a shirt? How do they know? They know everything about us. So that's it, there's no privacy. There's a lot of gossip, and the gossip goes around. The gossip sort of cements the village. And it's not ideal, because there are tensions. That's one of the things I tried to bring up, and which people, nobody, again, took that point. In the dialogue itself, the fact that in a community, there's a lot of closeness, but there are also tensions. And is that inevitably what you need to have a community? You need both. You need the shadow and the light. You need both in a community. And I see that in Paris. Yes, there are tensions, and recently there were some real tensions between the young people and the older people, because the young people wanted a room, and the older people thought, you know, they're just going to be making a mess and making a lot of noise at night, and so there were tensions. I think they've been resolved now, but you have to go through the tensions to get the resolution. Some years ago, when I still lived in Canada, the Royal Society of Canada had run a conference called The Cost of Inaction, and they asked me to give one of the first talks. And at that time, you know, people were concerned about the environment. There were many concerns, and the whole thing was, God, we've got to act now. We've got to act now. We've got to act now. And I thought, wait a minute, we're just going to rush in, as usual. And do we really understand what's going on? And so what I spoke about was that, maybe we need a creative pause just to see what is happening and then to take action. And the example I gave was there's a traffic accident. And now if you get out of your car, it's a traffic accident, you see someone in a car bleeding and you try to pull them out. I mean, you could really make things a lot worse. But when the ambulance crew arrive, they do a triage, they look at each case, and we're using their eyes before they touch, and then they decide, okay, that person's bleeding but it's not serious, that person needs immediate attention, this person needs transporting to hospital. So they have this pause before they act. And I think in our case we tend to see, oh gosh, this is so terrible, we must rush in and help. And so that's what the gentle action was about, was is there a more creative type of action? Is that often we act as if we're outsiders, we're outside the situation, and we're going to go in and help. The Native Americans told me the worst thing they can ever hear is they knock at the door and they open it, and as somebody's standing there, they say, we're from the government, we're here to help you. But there's so much of that, and part of it is experiences. My son, who worked for Doctors Without Boundaries, is now working for the International Red Cross, has seen how plans and policies, are formulated maybe somewhere in Washington or London or Paris, and then somebody is sent out to do something, but without fully understanding the nature of what is the situation, what are the local conditions, what is the local economy like, what if I make this intervention, how is it going to ripple down? So that's, and since then I've started a website, gentleaction.org, and people are sending in examples, and that's really neat. The idea that an individual can do something, one person can do something. Like a woman who went on the London Underground and tried to make somebody smile. And what if you can make somebody smile each day? What a great thing to do. What was it Voltaire said, attend to your garden? That was a nice one. I mean, I suppose that's the best I can do, is attend to where I'm living, this little village. And, the centre's in difficulty, we don't have any money, I don't know how we're going to survive another year, but if we do survive, have people come in, and it's amazing, people come in, and one nice thing has been that people have arrived. We had a lawyer from New York who came and said, oh, I can't go back to the law firm. He went back to the law firm. He came back a few months later and said, I can't go back to the law firm. Next I heard from him, he was in Beijing. And it's happened to quite a few people. They've completely changed their life. So they come to a place which is very different. As the local people say, you can breathe. You can breathe here. And they come to a place to breathe and realize, wait a minute. I've taken this path and I'm not happy with it. I'm going to take a different path. So it's like being a catalyst in a way. I think that's the nicest thing I think has happened, is people have taken different life paths.